The mountain does not care about your experience or your gear. It sits there in the Adirondacks, a jagged pile of granite and ice that has been watching us long before we learned to walk upright. Whiteface Mountain is a cold and indifferent god that occasionally reaches out to pluck a soul from the world of the living. Most people who go missing in these woods stay missing. But sometimes, the mountain decides to play a different game. It was February in upstate New York, a month where the air is so sharp it feels like inhaling broken glass. The wind whipped through the skeletal branches of the ancient pines, creating a low and rhythmic hum that sounded almost like a human voice. Danny was a man who knew the risks. Or at least he thought he did. He stood at the top of the ridge, looking out over a landscape that was nothing but varying shades of gray and lethal white. The snow was thick and heavy, the kind of accumulation that deadens all sound until you can hear your own heartbeat thumping against your ribs. He adjusted his goggles, feeling the cold plastic bite into his skin. There was a sense of finality in the air that afternoon, a feeling that the day was closing its eyes for the last time. He pushed off, the crunch of his skis against the frozen crust echoing like a gunshot in the unnatural silence of the peak. He was headed down toward the lodge, a simple trip that he had made dozens of times before. But as the shadows began to stretch and warp across the slopes, the trail seemed to change. The familiar markers were there, yet they felt alien, as if he was skiing through a replica of the mountain built by something that did not quite understand human geometry. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing against his chest like a physical weight. The missing 411 cases always have a moment where the world tilts. And for Danny, that moment arrived at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon. 1 minute he was carving through the powder, and the next, the sound of the wind simply stopped. It was not a gradual fading, but a sudden and violent vacuum of sound. He looked back at his tracks, but the snow behind him was pristine and undisturbed, as if he had dropped from the sky. He called out into the void, his voice sounding thin and metallic in the dead air. No echo returned to him, and the trees around him seemed to lean inward, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The cold was no longer just an environmental factor. It was a predatory presence that began to gnaw at his senses. He took a step toward what he thought was the trail, and the world dissolved into a gray and featureless haze. Back at the lodge, the minutes turned into hours as his friends waited for a man who would never arrive. They looked out into the gathering darkness, hoping to see the bobbing light of a headlamp or the silhouette of a friend. But the mountain remained silent and dark, a massive tombstone against the starlit sky. By the time the clock struck 8 o'clock that evening, the first whispers of dread had begun to take root in their minds. The search teams were mobilized by 9 o'clock the next morning, a small army of professionals and volunteers prepared for the worst. They moved through the brush with the precision of machines, their eyes scanning every drift and every crevice for a sign of the missing man. The Adirondacks are a brutal landscape for a search, full of false leads and treacherous terrain that can swallow a searcher just as easily as a victim. They found nothing. Not a sky, not a glove, not a single drop of blood. The dogs were the first to show that something was wrong, their hackles rising as they approached certain sections of the woods. They would whine and pull at their leashes, refusing to move forward into areas that looked perfectly normal to the human eye. These were trained animals, dogs that had found bodies buried under 10 feet of snow. Yet they were terrified of something they could smell but could not see. It was as if the mountain had developed a sour rot in its very soul. As the days bled together, the temperature plunged to 20 degrees below zero, a level of cold that kills the human body in a matter of minutes. The searchers moved like ghosts through a frozen purgatory, their breath blooming in clouds that hung in the air like spirits. They used thermal imaging from the air, scanning for a heat signature that should have been there. But the mountain remained cold. There was no life out there, only the ice and the wind. The missing 411 phenomenon often involves these impossible survival windows, where a person is gone for days in conditions that should have turned them into a block of ice. 6 days passed without a single clue, and the hope of finding him alive had evaporated like mist. His family was already preparing for the inevitable, waiting for the phone call that would tell them a body had been recovered from the spring thaw. The mountain had taken him, and it rarely gave back what it had stolen. Then, 3,000 miles away, the impossible happened. In the city of Sacramento, California, the sun was beating down on the asphalt of a rental car terminal. The air was thick with the smell of jet fuel and exhaust. A world away from the frozen silence of Whiteface Mountain, a man walked out of the shimmering heat haze, looking like he had just stepped off a bus from a different dimension. He was wearing a brand new tracksuit that he did not own 6 days ago, and his hair had been cut into a neat and professional style. He wandered toward the counter with the vacant eyes of a sleepwalker, his movements stiff and mechanical. He did not know where he was, or how he had gotten there, or why his hands were shaking so violently. He clutched a cell phone in his hand, a device that felt like an alien artifact in his grip. When the police arrived, they found a man who was physically healthy but mentally shattered. He told them he remembered the mountain, and then he remembered being in a vehicle. A large, moving vehicle. He remembered lights that were too bright to look at, and the feeling of being handled by people whose faces he could not recall. He was a puzzle with half its pieces missing. A survivor of an event that defied every law of physics we hold dear. The doctors examined him and found a mild concussion, but none of the signs of 6 days in the wilderness. His skin was not wind-burned. His feet were not frostbitten, and his clothes were clean and pressed. How does a man travel from New York to California in less than a week without a credit card, without an ID, and without any memory of the journey? The authorities looked for a logical explanation, but logic had abandoned this case the moment he stepped off that mountain. The missing 411 connection here is undeniable and terrifying. We see this pattern again and again. People disappearing in high-altitude environments and reappearing in distant locations with memory loss and physical alterations. It suggests that there are places on this earth where the fabric of reality is thin. Places where something can reach through and pull you into a different stream of time and space. We like to think of our world as a solid and stable thing, but Danny's story proves that it is more like a sieve. Perhaps the mountain did not just take him. Perhaps it processed him. If you look at the details, the new clothes and the haircut, it feels less like a kidnapping and more like a specimen being prepared for a new environment. Who are the entities that inhabit the deep woods and the high peaks? And what do they want with a firefighter from New York? We are like ants living on the edge of a highway, unaware of the giants that move around us until one of them picks us up and carries us across the state line. The theory of a dimensional slip or a localized wormhole starts to feel less like science fiction and more like a grim necessity when you face these facts. There is no plane ticket, no bus receipt, and no witness who saw him travel 3,000 miles across the heart of the country. He simply was on the mountain, and then he was in California. The space between those 2 points is a dark and empty void that Danny's mind refuses to enter. This is not the first time such a thing has happened in the history of the unexplained. In February of 1978, a man named Steven Kubacki disappeared while cross-country skiing near Lake Michigan. His skis and poles were found, and his tracks led directly to the edge of the frozen lake and then simply stopped, as if he had been lifted into the air. He woke up 15 months later in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, wearing clothes he did not recognize, and having no memory of the previous year of his life. The similarities between these two cases are staggering and point toward a predatory phenomenon that operates on a continental scale. Both men disappeared in the dead of winter. Both were in high-energy environments near water or mountains, and both returned with a total erasure of their experiences. It is a terrifying thought that you could be living your life, carving a turn on a ski slope, and in the blink of an eye, you are someone else, somewhere else. We look at the maps and we think we know where the borders are. But the mountain knows better. It knows that there are no borders in the dark, only the hunter and the prey. Danny returned to his family, but a part of him stayed on that mountain. Or perhaps in the place the mountain sent him. He carries the weight of those 6 missing days every time he closes his eyes. A silent passenger in a mind that no longer belongs entirely to him. The next time you find yourself in the high country, and the wind suddenly stops, do not look back for your tracks. They might not be there anymore, and you might find that the path you are on leads much further than you ever intended to go. The mountain is always watching, and it is always hungry for a new story to hide in its shadows. Stay on the trail, and keep your eyes on the horizon, because the world is much bigger, and much stranger, than they want you to believe. The Adirondacks still hold their secrets, and Whiteface Mountain still looms over the landscape like a silent sentinel. People still ski its slopes and hike its trails, unaware that they are walking over a trapdoor that could open at any second. We tell ourselves these stories to prepare. But how do you prepare for the impossible? You don't. You just hope that when the mountain reaches out, it chooses someone else. In the end, we are left with a man who traveled 3,000 miles through a hole in the world. He is a living testament to the fact that our reality is a fragile thing, easily torn and easily mended. We can call it Missing 411. We can call it a mystery, or we can call it what it truly is. A warning. The woods are not our home. We are just guests who have overstayed our welcome. And the mountain is starting to notice. So listen to the wind the next time it moans through the pines. And ask yourself if it is just the air, or if it is something else calling your name. Watch the shadows as they stretch across the snow, and wonder what they are hiding in their long, dark fingers. Because somewhere out there, another hiker is taking their last step, and another mountain is getting ready to blink. And when it does, the world will be one person smaller, and the mystery will be one chapter longer.